Good morning. This is day 3 of my book log. So today I'm doing The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. I heard this once be called like the first novel ever written. And a lot of people, it's just like a very early prose narrative. It's from the year like 1011. Some people say it's not right to call it a novel because novel is kind of like a European term, and this is like a Japanese epic sort of, but it's like a prose epic, right? And so at the time, most stuff was, if you were writing something down, it was poetry or it was like court documents, legal documents. So the idea of just like writing out a full prose narrative, like a story that you would tell your friend, to write that out was like an original idea. At least this is the first one that we have surviving to this day. But anyway, let's get into it. So the book is written in around like the early 1000s, but it takes place about 70 years before that. So it's like historical fiction. It takes place in like the 930s. And the funny thing is it's kind of written in this like, oh, back in the day kind of way that's like implying that everything now is really like shitty and the present sucks, like everything is corrupt and it was way better back in the olden days. I just think it's funny that even 1,000 years ago, everyone was like, wow, the past was great and the present is so newfangled and weird. And just in general, my favorite thing about this book is how it's like very recognizable. All the characters are very human. They do things that I feel that I can like relate to in a very like different modern way. But yeah, so it starts out. In a certain reign, there was a lady not of the first rank whom the emperor loved more than any of the others. The grand ladies with high ambitions thought her a presumptuous upstart, and lesser ladies were still more resentful. Everything she did offended someone. So this is the mother of Genji. She's kind of like a lesser concubine of the emperor. She's from like a less respected house. But then Genji turns out to be such an incredible boy. He's like the pinnacle of Heian era, Japanese Heian era, like masculinity. He's a perfect dancer. He can play the koto super well. And the most important thing is poetry. He's like really adept at writing poetry and like off the cuff, like freestyling poems. And all the poems in this book are like, the rule was it has to be 7 syllables, and it has to make like allusions to other famous poems of the era. But these are like very highly educated, noble, royal people. And they spend all their time just like reading poetry. And so this whole world is very drenched in poetry. And again, remember, like all the writing at the time was poetry. And so this is a prose narrative, like the fact that this is written in like normal human speak. And then it's just like still filled with poems. They all talk to each other in poems. So, So anyway, Genji is perfect and beautiful and amazing, and he's growing up. And most of what happens is they host a bunch of festivals. There's just a bunch of like royal celebrations all the time. Oh, not this one. Let's do, yeah. So this is just an example. They're hosted at the end of the second month. They're hosting the Festival of the Cherry Blossoms. The emperor's over here. This arrangement displeased, there's a bunch of politics going on. There's the minister of the left and the minister of the right. I don't really remember the details of the politics. I just kind of remember the world that it all takes place in. And so, they're all dancing and doing their various activities and drinking. Then they read their poems. Genji's work was so remarkable that the reader paused to comment upon each line. Everyone loves this guy. The professors were deeply moved. Since Genji was for the emperor a shining light, the poem could not fail to move him too. So then the party's over and Genji is very drunk. And now this is a part where, so this is, one of the darker sides of this book, and actually I think is kind of the main thrust of it if you are reading it in that way. So Genji is like an adolescent throughout this whole part. Eventually he gets older. Since this is just the first 12 chapters of like a 50-page thing, he's like an adolescent, and he spends most of this book just kind of like going around and like sleeping around with all these different court ladies. But the way that this sort of hookup culture works in this community is rape. So what'll happen is all the women are sort of like in the house of some male figure. their father, and then when they're older, it's like an emperor or some royal figure who like takes them. And the women all live together in these houses, and they have these doors, the sliding doors, and they're basically the men, when they get drunk at these parties, will then afterwards just go into the women's houses and like open the doors and like pick a woman to rape. And that's just kind of how it works. So that, but then like it seems like there is some consensual sex, and what happens is like the women, if they're horny too, and they'll leave the door slightly open, or at least that's the implication here. But the interesting thing, so Murasaki Shikibu is a woman. She's a woman. She is a court lady from this time. And so the whole book is written in this very interesting way where, of course, she's like catering to male tastes, and she won't say anything radical or opposed to the way that things are working. But she just like, she focuses on a lot of the women, and then like what'll happen is Genji will come like visit one of his like conquests, and then he leaves, and then the narration lingers at the woman's house. And he just like leaves he's like the shining Genji, and everyone loves him, and he's so great at making poems. And then he just leaves this trail of like really sad, lonely women. And I feel like that you can read that as being the main point of this book. So this is just one example of that. This one seems to be consensual. This woman left a door open, and then he's like looking to see if anyone's in there, and then she says, "What can compare with a misty moon of spring?" This is an allusion. Again, they're constantly making allusions to poetry. So this is a poem we're supposed to know. If we're hearing this in 1011, we're supposed to recognize this poem as being a big popular poem of the time. And so in the footnotes, they explain it. This is what it's a quote from. And they do this all the time, like the same way we would say, like, when in Rome, and everyone knows what that means. They'll just say like half a poem or a couple words from a poem, and that's supposed to like indicate something specifically. Also, so this is a woman saying this, and it's misquoted to make it sound less Chinese and therefore more feminine. I just want to talk about that for a minute because I had to research that when I read that. And at the time, so this is Japan, what we today call Japan. And at the time, I don't remember which dynasty, but China is a huge empire, like a really like massive invading empire. They have a lot of like cultural dominance in the whole region. And the Chinese, so everyone's using Chinese characters. So Japan was an oral culture until the Chinese influence, and they started using Chinese characters. But the Chinese characters are really like specific and difficult. And only like the royals, and especially the male royals, are educated in this like very complicated and sort of angular language. But there's sort of like this version of it that's developing, which is like more smooth and it's like less complicated, and it more reflects the way that Japanese is spoken, because of course they're just using Chinese characters, the syllables, to sort of imitate how they talk. It's kind of like an anglicization, the same way we do that now. But so it's sort of developing into Japanese, but that sort of like informal, what becomes Japanese writing is considered feminine at the time and like uneducated. So the women write in it's called like kanji and something else, I don't remember. But there's sort of the male letters and the female letters. And so the men and women in this society literally they speak the same language, but they write in different languages. And that's reflected in the way they interact. So she makes this poem reference, and then he says, "Late in the night we enjoy a misty moon. There is nothing misty about the bond between us." So they just sort of start saying poems to each other. They have sex. He sleeps over, and he wants to know who she is. And he says, "I wish to know whose dewy lodge it is, ere winds blow past the bamboo-tangled moor." That's supposed to mean, apparently, like, rumors are going to spread, I'm Genji, like, everyone's going to find out about this, so who are you? It's, turns out to just be one of, like, these royals' younger sisters or something. Lesser spring banquet, not one of the big festivals, just a little fun thing to amuse him. So that's the kind of thing that's happening in this book. Now, the main story is a romance. Again, we don't have the full book here. I don't know what happens later on, but in this chapter, they introduce the main romantic interest. She's referred to in this as Murasaki. Okay, here's something actually really like super wild about this book. none of the characters in the original have names. So I looked into it, and he talks about this in the translator talks about this in the opening notes, but it's not, I think it's not respectful at the time to refer to someone by a name, so you just refer to them by their title if it's a man, and by what they're wearing if it's a woman. So in the original, it would basically say something, and still in a lot of cases it says things like this with the men, where it'll say like, and then he spoke to the minister of the left, and then the whatever. But if it's talking about a woman, it says, and then they spoke to the woman in the like long orange robes. Everyone's wearing these robes with super long sleeves. There's a lot of like poetry about the sleeves. The sleeves are so long that they like scrape on the floor, or it's not scrape, they just like drag on the floor, and they get briny if you're near water, and people are always talking about their briny sleeves. So Genji is sick. He needs to get cured. And none of the religious rituals are working in town. So he hears about this sage who lives in a mountain nearby, and he goes off in disguise because he doesn't want people to recognize him as the emperor's son. He visits this mountain sage. He does a bunch of incantations and things, and cures Genji. And then Genji's just sort of in this like little mountain village, and finds this, I think it's like a nun house, I don't know, but he meets, I don't remember the details, he meets this girl who's, okay, this is really horrifying and weird, but he meets this girl who is 10 years old. So again, remember, this is written from, so okay, the girl's name, the 10-year-old girl, her name that they stick with is Murasaki. That means lavender, and she's just referred to as like the girl of lavender, because I think she like, the home that he finds her in is like, there's a bunch of lavender bushes. So they refer to her throughout as Lavender or Murasaki. And that is also the name that we give the person who wrote this book. We don't know her actual name. We don't know what people called her, because again, people didn't really have names in the court. It was very like rude, I think, to refer to people by a name. So she is identified in the literature with this girl, with this 10-year-old girl, who later turns into Genji's love interest. So I think the idea is maybe this is semi-autobiographical or based on reality, and she was, her experiences as being a court lady who was courted by this like incredible like son of the emperor or whatever. But she's 10 years old, right? And Genji is a skis, and he says that she looks a lot like Fujitsubo, which is a woman who he has a crush on, but I forget why they like can't be. I think it's a political thing where she's related to like the wrong minister. So he sees this 10-year-old girl, and he says, I want to like make her into my ideal. Who might she be? He was beginning to make plans. The child must stand in place of the one whom she so resembled. So he basically, what a delight if he could take her into his house and make her his ideal. So he asks the people, like, can I take this girl? That's usually something you wait to do until the girl is like 16, and you can like marry her and impregnate her. And so they're all really weirded out, and they're like, this is way too young. And he's like, oh, you just impugn my intentions. I have no such, I just want to like cultivate her. And so, he's Genji, he gets what he wants. And so this girl comes to live in his mansion or whatever, in just a wing of his mansion. And she spends like we only get up to, he's like, I think like 30 or something at the end of this book. And that whole time, Murasaki's not in the picture. She's just like in this room practicing her calligraphy and her poetry, and growing out her hair to be beautiful. And he comes and visits her every now and then, but she's like 12, right? So it's just like a really kind of cold and jarring situation. Anyway, so he goes around, goes to a bunch of festivals, rapes a bunch of women, and then eventually, let's see what else we got. The main, like, there's not a ton of story, really. So, I mean, a lot of what I liked about this was, again, the world, the poetry is really interesting. There's some stuff I learned from the notes at the beginning. There's a ton of puns that, of course, are not translatable. But it's just because everything's poetic, because everything's approximate, you really have to, guess what it could have meant in the original, because we're so far removed from even what that was. So this is, I thought, a really beautiful passage this is from the translator. Some of the puns are so common that the introduction of one image into a poem will immediately introduce a second. A pine tree, for instance, usually brings with it a suggestion of unrequited love, of waiting and yearning. For Matsu, pine also means to wait. Mention of the long summer rains usually does double duty, having reference also to a time of sad brooding tedium. Falling rain or snow is also the passage of time. The autumn is surfeit or neglect, fisherman is a nun. The river, barrier, and gate of Osaka suggest a meeting, as is the province or lake of Omi. An iris is also discernment or a pattern. A rat is also a root and a cry. An imperial progress is also a deep snow. To pluck as of plants is also to heap up or accumulate as of years. To cut off is also to depart. A letter or other specimen of calligraphy is also a trail. A wild goose suggests also evanescence or transience. That is amazing. I would love to see 1,000 years from now an analysis of the puns in our language and sort of what, because you read this and you have a sense for what life is like. I think at least you get like a little snippet of what kind of things are important, what kind of things are related to what other things. Anyway, the last thing, there's kind of a little bit of story where the politics, because Genji ends up marrying. He actually has a wife this whole time. He's married to the daughter of the minister of the left, I think, and he hates her. She's boring. He wants to go sleep with other women. But then, like, the politics, there's a falling out. The minister of the right becomes more powerful. So Genji's out of favor. He's shamed in court. He can't show his face. And so he decides to put himself into exile. And he goes to the coasts of Suma, which is a nearby island area, I think, where it used to be a rich sort of imperial place, but then the boom busted and there's a bunch of just abandoned royal homes there. So he goes to these sort of like haunting abandoned homes, and he brings obviously like 14 of his servants with him. He's kind of just whining about, I must go into exile, I'm so sad, I have no one to talk to, and he's just like he's brooding and staring at the moon and the water and the tides and praying and doing rituals and stuff. And that was, I thought, a really nice chapter. I mean, this book really just takes you out of the world. It's really amazing. I was reading this on the subway, and I kept, like, anytime I looked up and saw, like, a subway ad for some TV show or something, I was just like, what a weird and arbitrary time I live in. Like, life has been so many different things. Yeah, that's kind of it. There's a couple of random little things. I love the way, most of this book is about sort of the sex culture and the festival culture. It's definitely a rape culture, but there are a lot of similarities to our current culture. There's, the funny thing with these poems is they also write these poems, these 2-line, 7-syllable poems. And so basically after Genji has sex with someone, he'll leave in the morning as the moon is setting. The moon is everywhere in this book. And he'll send his servant Korimitsu with like a little slip of paper, but I think it's like the old fabric-y kind of paper. And it has, like, when he writes basically a morning after text as a poem and sends it, and then she sends one back, and it's always these like, oh, the old cuckoo will come back to crow at the nest where he has once lain his head, or something like that. That's cool. There's like a momentary like gay romance thing where he and his male friend, or like it doesn't happen, but they're sitting there and they're very friendly and loving. And Genji, he just says like, he thought that if he were not a man, he would have loved him, whatever. So I don't know how acceptable or, how restrictive sexuality was in that sense in this period. I couldn't find info on that. Yeah, I think that's good for today. This book is really cool. It can be a little boring because it's just festival after festival, and not a lot like happens plot-wise, but I am really interested to know sort of where it goes from here. I think, and Genji eventually becomes the emperor, or something happens, who knows. That's it.